Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. Now, believe it or not, we actually have some opening news that is not related to the Kung Flu. Now, it will come. We will discuss some of it. We'll try to stay away from the discussing the actual topic itself and discuss more of the impacts and results of it happening for both better and worse. But right now, we're going to get into our normal Middle Eastern news with Syria. Now, this wasn't exactly a majorly eventful week for Syria, but there were a few things that happened, and let me just pull up the list of topics I had. Just a few things. Well, first was there were, of course, more Israeli strikes that were intercepted by Syrian air defenses. It's been a while since we've seen that one. That one's a bit of a throwback to a couple years back, which I plan on getting into. The other major topic is the U.S. actually turned around a Russian convoy in northeastern Syria. You can see by the oil fields with the blue circle with the line through it. That's where it happened. Now, that's the first case I believe something like this has happened. It's usually the other way around. It's usually the Russians turning American patrols around or Syria turning American patrols around. But it turns out the United States got the upper hand right now. I mean, I imagine at this point, with the way things are, all factors considered, it must not have been that important, or else the Russians wouldn't have just turned around and taken that loss. So I'm assuming it must have been over something minor, if anything at all. And probably one of the bigger pieces of news is that the Jarabulus border crossing with Turkey has reopened. Now that's that dark blue circle with a line through it on the map near the actual like Kurdish, but also Idlib border. So it's strange for two reasons. Considering I believe that's actually a government slash SDF controlled checkpoint. So it's a bit odd that I don't know. Maybe some deal was reached. We'll get into it in a minute. Macron and Putin actually met on the topic of Syria, but it also seems odd considering the entire pandemic thing going on that a border crossing would actually be opened.
Right, but as far as I know, Erdogan has actually called back many of the refugees that were on Greek borders.
I think I heard a thing or two about that, and yeah, he backed down even before this got too bad. But now that it's gotten to this level, it seems like he's completely backed down out of the whole sending refugees to the border thing.
Yeah, and I must say that Europe really, 3 weeks ago, almost 4 weeks ago, did so. Um, Even before, I think there was the COVID pandemic. Before I think Europe was really taking it seriously in the way that it does now. So I don't know. I think the fear of an outbreak and refugees amongst refugees and migrants was probably a very real fear. But I think that 2015 and the fear of that stoking nationalism within Europe was probably the bigger fear. Um, but he has no wiggle room right now, and he knows it.
Yeah, and we talked about this for about the past 3 4 weeks now. How he went from one of the strongest secondary leaders in the world to the point where he had a lot of influence with both the West, with Russia, with even China at that point, and he all squandered it on pretty, I wouldn't say insignificant, pretty small campaigns in both Syria and Libya.
Hmm. Yeah, Libya is not turning out very well for him. In the last week or so, another 100, Turkish-backed Syrian fighters have died there with no gains, nothing changing the outcome of the war in even a small way. But I mean, I might be wrong, but I think as far as the Russian patrols being turned back by the U.S., I think I'm not sure in which area, but I think there is a precedent for this. It has happened before. What has become unusual and what did take place this week is a U.S. patrol was stopped by the Syrian army and various Kurdish uh, fighters or peoples mixed in amongst the Syrians. um, but relatively speaking, there's not that much going on in Syria right now in terms of hostilities. There is, however, a kind of alarming development with Turkey using some of these various jihadists to patrol the M4 highway leading to Latakia from Sarakib. And that is an interesting proposition because a lot of these groups are affiliated with Al Sham and other, and with Turkish, the Turkish party group that's also been fighting there. That is actually very hard to control. They've actually killed some Turkish-backed forces and Turkish soldiers in the last 2 weeks over disputes with the M4 highway. So I don't know how that's going to go, but Syria has responded with fresh troops. They have uh, re-injected their numbers with new men, and they have moved around Sarakib and all along the Idlib border on the east side from the recent gains that they acquired in February. So it's quiet now, but I don't suspect it's going to remain quiet for that much longer because essentially the M4 highway now de facto becomes a highway for the jihadists, for the Western backed and Turkish backed jihadists, which really doesn't do anything for Syria. Um, so that's all. And besides, and you mentioned the Israeli strike, which seems most of its missiles were intercepted, probably because there's so few passenger planes in the air. Where are they going to hide? I mean,
No civilian airliners. What? What? How could this be?
wait. I mean, the F-35 cloaking system was infiltrated.
Oh no!
Yeah, oh, terrible.
This must be part of that Soviet Zionist pact where Israel and Russia are secretly cooperating.
That's it is. It is. It's they're bringing about the downfall of America.
Look, the only way to fight
But
against the only way against the fight against Jewish influence is to support more liberalism. Okay, you hear me, people?
yeah,
But
yeah.
in all seriousness, I feel obligated to discuss this just because of the annual basis on which this happens. So, as we record this, it is the evening of March 31st, 2020. Now, April is a special time in Syria. Spring is in bloom. All these wonderful things are happening, and the wonderful smell of sarin in the air.
Oh, wow.
Now, in 2017, we all know the story. Of course, all of a sudden, a chemical weapons attack on a rebel stronghold was done by the dastardly Assad regime, and Trump responded with overwhelming force. 2018 it happens yet again. Trump responds with even more force across the country. 2019 it happens. Nobody cares. Do you think they'll even be dumb
Yeah.
enough to try it this time around with all the factors
Uh,
happening right now?
Probably not. Probably not. I would never say never. uh, we'll get into it later, but the optics right now for America doing that in Syria are quite bad. Given the recent aid delivered not only to Italy but to America by Russia. So, but we'll get into that later.
Yeah, and like you said, don't count it out because I would have thought in 2018 they wouldn't do it 2 years in a row. I would have thought a lot of things would have gone in a different direction, but knowing the, again, as you put it in previous episodes, the schizophrenia of American foreign policy, whether that be Trump, whether that be Pompeo, or the deep state, administrative state, however you want to refer to it, yeah, anything is possible. But The last thing we really
Like
have.
if
What?
like if Putin only like administers a life-saving treatment to Trump and the GOP, anything goes.
Trump is truly Putler's puppet at that point.
Yes. Corona aid, but only for the GOP.
Libtards get the coof.
Yes.
But the last topic for Syria we have before we get into Iraq and Yemen is Macron and Putin had a teleconference. That's how diplomacy is conducted in these trying times. They you give each other a nice phone call. You go to online summits. Very, very strange times we're living in. And the statement from the Kremlin says actual aspects of the settlement in Syria and Libya are affected. It was agreed to continue contacts at various levels. So it looks like, absent of even Turkey or Germany or any of the other major powers usually involved, that France and Russia alone came to peace settlements on Syria and Libya, which, judging by the lack of fighting in both and the French boats sent to stop migrant ships coming from Libya, it may actually be enacted. And who would have thought all it took for cooperation with Russia and a Western power on geopolitical hotspots was a global pandemic?
Mm, yes.
I mean, it is, as we'll get into later in the episode with some of the other things we'll be discussing, it is amazing how much this has shifted geopolitics as a whole. And look, despite the fact I'm sure those of you listening probably have heard a million different things from a million different people talking about this subject over and over, but I hope, at least, what my intention is to look at the other effects of this beyond the infection rate, beyond the death rate, beyond the nitty gritty that a lot of people have admittedly done very good work on. But we're not here to do that. We're here to look at what impact this is causing on the topics we normally cover.
Mm. Yes. I mean, it's this pandemic in a way has, I mean, not in a way, well, in a very real way, has changed the political landscape completely. Um, Everything from being a determining factor or one of the determining factors in stemming the tide of migrants and refugees from Turkey to just less woke takes. I mean, I think it's been mentioned before, but Vice had an article about how life-saving trans surgery is being delayed because of the coronavirus. Like, as if anybody gives a blank. Like, just shut up. So, so people actually can actually prioritize, and I think what's most astonishing is just how much of our global homo governments have, to a great extent, um prioritized. Now, people, of course, yes, I understand. I guess lots of our viewers are concerned if this is going to be, a precedent, and the talk of martial law and so on and so on and so on. But I would say the situation is more serious than that. And in terms of, like, bro, it really isn't just the flu. Um, some people you just can't convince. However, if we look at what has developed, that is more division in the EU, more sort of even basic civic nationalist sentiments in the EU. You find France, Italy, other countries as well singing their national anthem rather than the EU national, anthem, or I guess the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth.
Or John Lennon's Imagine.
Um, yeah. John Lennon's Imagine. Oh my God. So true.
Imagine all the
And
cringe.
imagine if he were alive, he wouldn't have voted for Brexit. So, So you can tell. I mean, it's changed the landscape. Everybody kind of acknowledges that now. So there's momentum there. Uh, and all kinds of unexpected things are happening. A lot of them are optics, but also have a substantive quality to them, no less than Russia, really going out of its way to help out Italy, which optically for the EU looks, there's no other way to describe it, horrible. We're looking at this immensely wealthy region of the planet, second only to the U.S., sophisticated, modern, and they cannot coordinate. And like most neoliberal governments, the advice was steered by concerns about xenophobia and the market. And now they're scrambling and paying the price for it. We're going to see Italy, it's well over, I mean, it's 11,000 now. We're probably going to see for Italy suffered something like 12,000 deaths. Uh, Spain, you know, people 65 and older are being denied respirators because they don't have enough.
Yeah,
But I'm going way off topic. But yes,
more
way,
appropriately, you're
way off
getting way
topic.
ahead of yourself.
Yes.
But we will move over into Yemen and then Iraq and then into Europe. So Yemen, it looks like it's been a quiet time there. We have not discussed the topic much because ultimately it came to what was pretty much an unofficial ceasefire. There was really no fighting back and forth between the Houthi and Saudi-backed forces, but it seems like ever since this oil price war started, the Houthis have really taken advantage of this and made their move. And I mean, it's like the summer of 2018 with how drastic this is in terms of Saudi Arabia being, I would say, absolutely embarrassed by, again, third-rate rebels who can hardly afford food or the basic necessities of life, yet are still being outmaneuvered by them militarily. And that's also considering the fact that Iran is having a hell of a time with the virus itself and hasn't really been able to dispense aid in the same way it has been in previous years, even in previous months. So this is all pretty much the Houthis. I imagine there's some Iranian aid that has helped that they got before all this happened, but pretty much absent of any outside aid, completely doing this on their own, and frankly, it's impressive. Now, I would say the reason they struck is, again, obviously the oil prices, but in the minds of them, it's probably a morale thing, a symbolic thing, where Saudi Arabia is the petrostate. It functions on oil revenues. Its population lives on welfare checks from oil revenues or on government jobs funded by oil. And all of a sudden, when oil prices go down, worse than even 2014, 2015, this is the time to strike. This is time to strike a blow at their morale. Because I imagine some payments have probably been suspended. People probably aren't getting as generous benefits as they were in the past. And yeah, if there's any time to really strike a blow at the heart of Saudi Arabia, it would be now.
Yeah, and as South Front predicted that the falling of oil prices will embolden Houthis to strike. I mean, they've struck Riyadh, they've struck the capital of Saudi Arabia just yesterday, and there have been retaliatory strikes in Houthi-held territory. However, if you look at on aggregate over the last 2 weeks, the Houthis are they're destroying about 100 vehicles a week, and we're talking tanks, armored personnel carriers. They have 38 millimeter cannons. This is something like a Panzer II or Panzer III would have had in World War II. These aren't like they're not just an armored box, right? Like they have sophisticated weaponry. They have small cannons, very strong machine guns as well on the turret. These are very substantively made equipment, and they are being taken out. I you know I think we are looking at a breaking point for Saudi Arabia. I think also to that I would add that Trump has asked to meet with Putin to discuss oil prices, and that to me is basically America and Saudi Arabia, you know, saying uncle. They've had enough because this is going to destroy America's shale industry as well. Uh, it can't handle anything under $44 a barrel. We are under 20, and it's been several weeks now. Uh, the Russians have guessed that they can dip into this fund that they've been saving up for a very long time for such an event. Really makes you think, but
Hmm.
yeah, I don't know. Like, it's one country that's really benefiting from this. So, anyways, that to me says that things are not going to go very well for Saudi Arabia, and that there is going to be some capitulation. And maybe this is why Russia sending help is a way to, in a way, to set a tempo of goodwill, to create an atmosphere of cooperation in order to gloss over what really underneath the surface has been an oil war. It has been kind of do or die, and it's not over yet. But I think we're going to see like really substantial things develop in the next few months with in terms of what happens in Yemen and what happens in Saudi Arabia and even Syria and Iraq for that matter. I think the potential is there in a very big way. So, I mean, optically, what you're going to, and I'm sure America will, don't get me wrong, but they're going to introduce more sanctions on Russia, even though Russia is helping them with medical aid for the coronavirus. So, but it's, optically, it's not going, I would say, America's way right now.
Yeah, honestly, it is wild because the only winner out of all this, like, yeah, even China's taking some hits because of their response, their withholding information, which again we got into last week. Expect nothing less from a society that's been that secretive for how many thousands of years. But again, we went over that last week. And really, the only winner of the optics war of who looks the best in all this, it's the Russians, not the EU, not the U.S., not China, not any of these other countries. It's Russia. Now, before we get into that, France has ordered a complete and full withdrawal of their forces from Iraq, citing the coronavirus as the reason they want to pull out. Now, of course, the usual suspects are saying this will only strengthen ISIS, this will only strengthen the terrorists, and but while also simultaneously saying it'll strengthen the Iranians. So, you know, try to square that circle. It's really, again, we've been over this before. It can only really be one or the other. And I mean, we've seen the U.S. close down several bases. We've seen them withdraw a significant amount of troops. We've seen them hand over bases to the Iraqis. And of course, this is all on the heels of Iraq ordering foreign troops to leave its soil after the Soleimani debacle. And again, they can use the current crisis as a pretext of why we need to get out, at least in the French example. And that's a palatable case even to the more hawkish elements in their government because there's more pressing matters at hand. But I have a feeling it goes beyond that, and then that this is just the perfect excuse to do something they've wanted to do for quite a while now.
Yeah, I would agree with you. The tax really on American bases, I think, they have been relentless. They have not subsided since Soleimani. In fact, they've intensified. And America is leaving Kirkuk, which is nothing to sneeze at. They've been there a very long time, and they can say it's COVID, or they can say that they've successfully defeated ISIS, but these are major developments. And what I see happening is America basically having like a smaller, tighter area of control, not willing to cede the entire country. Of course, we all know that Iraq had already asked shortly after Soleimani's assassination for America to leave Iraq. However, of course, America is never going to do that unless it absolutely has to do that. So it is significant. And, you know, closing down three bases is can't just be and France too. This can't be just about COVID. This, uh, those troops are not being realigned somewhere else. I don't even think the NATO drills being conducted in the Baltics can explain that. Uh, I have not heard any kind of relocation to to the Far East to contain China. I haven't. There's nothing that I've read that would suggest that that's what's happening. So yeah, I would say a smaller, tighter area of control and monitoring, but on some level, they have capitulated some areas, and one of those bases is also on the Syrian border. So
Yeah, and again, I'm not really surprised by any of this, and I would say not necessarily this was a pretext to get out, more so as a straw that broke the camel's back, where really the foreign military engagements that they were already debating ending. This comes up, and all of a sudden, everything else goes out the window. And frankly, I think I'm not going to complain about it. I think now is as good a time as ever. Frankly, I would prefer we done this sooner, but lo and behold, I'll live with what we get. But it just shows another way this crisis is completely realigning the global order, and it will be interesting with Western powers withdrawing, with Iran completely indisposed with their own internal issues, how this will shape Iraq. Now, I think Iraq, at least for the foreseeable future, is much too damaged beyond repair to have another strongman type leader such as a Saddam Hussein or any figure of that type to come to power. But you never know. And if there were a time for something like that, it would probably be right now.
yeah, because you have cover essentially, right? People, in terms of politics and optics, uh, this is as good as time as any. People won't. People are distracted, rightly so, to more pressing issues. And in fact, what could be done? I mean, I saw headlines about America willing to escalate the situation in Iraq. Um, I don't know. I don't think Trump can afford to do that uh, on an election year. Maybe next year will be a different story, but I don't see it in 2020. I don't know how you increase the amount of engagement with these militia forces in Iraq, and at the same time deal with COVID. And at the same, I mean, I understand how COVID can give you cover. I get that, but people can't. It won't go completely unreported. And the reality is that if American news sites don't cover it, um, non-American web news sites will, and that includes RT. And a lot of people watch RT, and so that will beg the question: why is America being so quiet about this? And on and on and on. And so um, there are just too many concerns right now, and it's an election year, and I just don't see how you can close down bases, but be willing to escalate matters. This is not strategic. If it gets carried out, it will be simply tactical.
Well, just further on that point, I saw the same headlines. I think I actually sent them your way. And think about this: if America does deepen its involvement in Iraq, even just with a few thousand troops and air power to fight these militias, whatever, the Iranians, despite their problems fighting the outbreak, will be forced to send some aid and some forces, at least in an advisory role. And
Yeah.
that's a recipe for disaster. Iraq, they have had cases, but not as much as an outbreak. You have the Iranian aid coming in, you have Iranians coming in. That's probably going to spread in Iraq. Them engaging with Americans, probably going to spread to American forces, and by extension, whatever forces join our second quote unquote coalition of the willing, if you will. And yeah, how long until, like I said, even special forces, you get these troops coming home? And again, even some of them are asymptomatic because, again, our testing has, like, it's been better than a lot of countries, but it's by no means perfect. It's by no means even, I would say, acceptable. How long until you get an asymptomatic case of someone who was fighting in Iraq going home to their families and spreading it further? It's a recipe for disaster on multiple
Mhm.
levels, which is why I don't see it happening anytime in the near future. But with the Middle Eastern news out of the way, I think it's time for the topic of the show, the big topic. And Viktor Orban he's finally done it. We've joked about this, we've memed about this for how long
Oh,
now?
at least a year.
At least a year, probably
More than a
longer.
year.
Uh, he has seized absolute emergency powers. Now, a part of this is power has been transferred to the office of prime minister for just complete executive decisions, pretty much defangs the legislature, and also suspends local referendums and local elections for the time being. Now, Hungary's next national level election is scheduled for, I believe, 2023. So it'll probably clear up by then, and just for the sake of international pressure, for the sake of keeping the peace, we'll probably see another Hungarian election, another free and fair Hungarian election. But we're going to get Emperor Orban for just a little bit, for at least, I would say, at least a year, since he plans on extending this until the end of 2020, probably further, for probably however long this crisis lasts. Now, we also discussed this last week, 2 weeks ago, that this includes shutting down quote unquote misinformation about the virus and penalizing that with up to 5 years in prison. Now, as we
So
discussed, in a Hungarian system that would probably be targeted towards like major media figures rather than your average everyday person. But I mean, even I didn't see this coming. And again, we have followed Orban closely. He's probably been one of the favorite world leaders of this show, arguably more than Putin at some points. And the
mhm.
fact that he's completely done this, on top of banning Soros from his country, banning all the, I wouldn't say all the social liberalism, but things like the gender studies and the racial studies, and a lot of the liberal influence has been purged from Hungary, and not even the Hungarian
Women's
courts are saying,
studies.
yeah, not even the Hungarian courts are saying anything. So we can only presume. I'm not sure about this far into internal politics that he probably put loyalists in the courts. He probably cleansed the quote unquote Hungarian deep state and put allies of himself in power. But he's done it,
Right.
and
Yes. Yeah. It's estimated that roughly 21%, 22% of European judges in the EU are funded or receive some kind of a cut from NGOs run by Soros, like directly funded by him. And I would say the judiciary is pretty quiet in Hungary because I think they're frankly afraid. Uh, and of course, Orban has set the dial to Reichstag. So
it's like 1933 all over again. Like it's how
I,
long
I
until he
can't
exercised Hungarian
believe
irredentist
it's
claims?
happening.
Well, honestly, if you want to go down that road,
But yeah, I'm sure some of them are intimidated.
yeah. But if you do want to go down that road, just kind of kidding here, a lot of the post World War One treaties with the quote unquote Kingdom of Hungary expired this year, so we may see some interesting developments.
Hmm.
Uh, Croatia's looking pretty appealing right now. Maybe Transcarpathia, Slovakia. If only, if only. Yeah, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, more like the Magyar-Austrian Empire. But in all seriousness,
Yeah,
this again is one of those things that's a major ripple that's been caused by all this, because of course the pretext for him invoking these emergency powers is the Kung flu outbreak, the global pandemic going on currently, and it's it's almost funny because he's sort of replaced both Belarus and Russia as the face of autocracy in Europe. And you're going to see those
yeah,
pieces coming out. You're already seeing them come out over the next few days. Oh, how dictatorship prevailed in Hungary, and how the liberal West did nothing, and we're letting the next Hitler rise to power, and how long until he expels the Roma population, or again all the usual talking points they
yeah.
blather on about.
Right. I mean that's coming. Curiously, Western media has not really looked forward to talking about Orban, and that's probably because giving Orban a platform in a way would only embolden other EU countries to do the same.
Oh no, if
But
they
I mean,
even if they give the most skewed, dishonest look they can, people are going to look at it and think, well, it looks like it's working for them. So why not us? I think the only place, and this is even debatable at this point, this would not catch on, is in Anglosphere countries where the tradition of liberty is a bit stronger. But granted, we've seen how that's gone in many ways. But again the hollow shell left of the tradition of liberty in Anglo countries, I'll say. But
yeah,
you're going to have a lot of European countries, like I said, even probably some parts of the Anglosphere that look at this and think, that's effective. Sort of like how CNN put out the article last week saying how Russia's using authoritarianism to curb the virus outbreak, and all of a sudden, like, they condemn it, they say how Putin is bad, but they don't say it doesn't work. In fact, they pretty much admit to the fact that it seems to be working for them. It seems that the low infection rate in Russia is due to the fact that they're willing to take authoritarian measures.
right, right, and they didn't even do, like a kind of a hard. They did a hard stop, but not quite to the degree. Not that, let's say, a combination of what China did and South Korea did, because, well, I mean, South Korea has to be commended for testing so many people and creating facilities to quickly test everybody, not just target testing, but literally testing, like giving the most amount of ability for people to get tested, right? They did that. They moved very quickly. As far as I know, many of the flights were canceled. So that happened very rapidly. And then they had this trace program where if they know that you have it, they monitor you. You work with them, and so that they know who you're in contact with, and they would get tested, and so on and so on. So Russia didn't do anything like that, but and I think, frankly, I think that was a mistake. So far in Russia now, there are 17 dead. The last time I checked today, it's not a heck of a lot, but you know, uh, these pandemics come back, and it won't necessarily even be the same strain. It'll be something else, and it's important for a state essentially to be on top of these things, because we are all going to experience the fallout to all of this, especially the economic fallout. Not to ignore the social fallout. So yeah, Russia, yeah, they are essentially admitting that the policy worked. Um, as they have with China, but in a way, when mainstream media says it worked, with regards to China, in the West that gets a little bit of pushback, probably because there's a little bit of cheap xenophobia, cheap racism there embedded, like, because they're not European, and I think in some ways it's understandable. But when they have to admit that it's worked for Russia as well, there's a kind of a reluctance about it for the mainstream media, but there's no pushback from the public. And you get a kind of a reverse scenario that happens when it's about China. Because, of course, that's where the outbreak happened. And, there's a lot of conservatives that are very upset and they want to blame China for all of this. But the truth is, if you're watching a country that's already had several of these types of pandemics, epidemics, okay, uh, SARS, hello, H1N1, hello, and lots of people, far more people died in China, just in China, during those two. If you're watching a country that is that builds 9 hospitals in 1 week and literally shuts down a city of 10 million, and then the province, like there's nothing. You don't have to ask what exactly is going on there, right?
Exactly. And the reason I'm so critical of a lot of Western leaders trying to, who did nothing for months upon months, and then all of a sudden ask China, why did they spread the virus here, is that, look, if they were completely insular about that, if we had no idea any of this was going on, that would be an understandable response. And I would say it's even understandable to a degree that, yeah, look, China, they should have been more open about this. But again, a lot of that goes out the window, at least in my opinion, when a country like Russia that has good relations with China, that shares a direct land border with them, has the foresight to do that before this is even announced as a pandemic or even a significant problem.
Right. I mean, you could ask, like, why did those nasty New Yorkers take off to Rhode Island and Florida? Like, I mean, there's no conspiracy there. They know that that things are going to clamp down harder because the disease is, because the virus is going to get worse, and people take off. They panic. They don't want to be there during that time, and so we know that this happened in China. About They estimate about 5 million people left Wuhan and Hubei province to go to other parts of China and to go to other parts of the world. I mean, I personally don't think the communist government directed them to do this to spread the disease, despite what like some magapeds might think. I think it's a natural reaction, and you know that's literally what like people in other countries have done under those circumstances because they don't want to live under quarantine. It's not smart. I mean, it's not like really good for society to, have individuals that think so selfishly. But the truth is they do. And I
Which
mean,
is why you
I
need
don't want
certain
to,
measures to enforce it, like we see,
yeah,
like I said, China, and especially in Russia, which just announced their lockdown with the week paid vacation, which will probably be extended, with Hungary, with Italy, and again, like, think what you will about China and think what you will about their numbers. I personally don't think they're being entirely honest with us, but you look again at other countries that have taken a similar response. I keep on mentioning these two over and over, such as Hungary, such as Russia, even to Poland with the closing of travel to Poland. It works when you restrict travel because you stop the people whose first instinct is to flee, you prevent them from doing that.
right. And there's also, South Korea and Japan, who, especially South Korea, who arguably deal with Chinese tourists far more than, and just look at their proximity, far more than anyone in Europe right now at the moment. Uh, I mean, there's exceptions. Okay, so London, of course, would have a lot. Not to mention the United States and Canada, but there's a steady stream of Chinese that routinely go into South Korea, very much like the U.S. Canadian border with regards to Niagara Falls, and that is a huge potential for contamination, right? And South Korea acted very, very quickly on that. So yeah, I mean, I don't believe the figures that are coming out of China. I don't even believe that's because of the way people were tested, or I'm sure to some degree the government is probably lying.
Yeah, I think
However,
the government actually outright said that they did not count asymptomatic cases as part of the total number of cases. So,
Mm.
again, we're working with a lot of information that China may not be entirely upfront about this, and then they're surprised when
Right.
China wasn't entirely upfront about this.
Right. And also there is the whole question of the median age that is being affected, right? So the median age apparently in Wuhan in the hospitals was 48 or 49 years of age. The median age of people in the hospital in Italy, especially in northern Italy, is like 71 or 72. So that might explain quite well like why the mortality rate in Italy is so bad right now. Italy does have the second oldest population in Europe.
Yeah, and
So all
again,
of these things factor in.
that's still on top of we're working with a lot of unknown variables about the actual disease itself. But like I
Hmm.
said, we're not going to get too much into the nitty gritty of all that. But
Right.
one of the more surprising developments out of this, now I don't know whether to take this as a sign that things may clear up or if it's really that bad, that Russia sent an aid plane to the United States. Now, according to the Kremlin, Putin asked Trump if the United States needed help, and Trump accepted. Now, this is, again, it's wild to think about, and a bit off putting and concerning to me is the fact that, not that I don't trust the Russians, I mean, again, I trust them, I would say slightly more than most countries, but again, as much as I can trust a modern state. But
Hmm.
beyond that, I'm concerned insofar as if the United States is willing to let Russian aid in, how bad has it gotten, or how bad do they think it's going to get?
Right. Well, we saw the largest amount of deaths in one day today, which was over 700, which is it's a lot. And I think for Americans, I think 3,000 is this kind of barrier because a lot of people are reminded of 9/11 about the 3,000 that were killed. And so, you know, the rate right now, it has come to over 3,000 dead. Um, and that's going to cause a certain amount of reflection on the situation. So, I mean, at the very moment, we are at 3,867. It's bad. Um, I mean, if people did like if nothing was done, can you just imagine if literally nothing was done? Can you imagine what hospitals would be like? Like we don't know the story of people waiting for operations. We don't know all the kinds of things that have been compromised because of this. No, just that's with like putting in effort to the point that people are crying out tyranny. But imagine if nothing was done. Imagine what hospitals would be like.
Oh, yeah,
Like,
absolutely. And it's, I know some people that work at hospitals, rural as they may be, and they're more concerned than I usually see them. But again, I'm not going to get into that. But also, as we mentioned, Russia put their country on lockdown. And one thing, this, again, we've heard a million of these claims. We heard this from Romania back in January, but Russia has claimed to create an anti COVID 19 drug. Now, this is of March 28th, 2020, and this is the Russian Federal Medical Biological Agency. So, again, sort of the state-run agency. I would say equivalent to a Department of Health and Human Services in the United States, as it were. And Putin, again, this is where I think it gets political. This is where I think it's probably a lot of talk. Says Russia may defeat the coronavirus in less than 3 months. Now, he said that on March 26th, and the article on Sputnik gets into the aid planes he sent around the world, specifically to Italy, and the quarantines they've enacted for non-essential workers and people over the age of 65, starting from March 28th. With the paid week-long vacation, and this also follows the news that Russian scientists successfully sequenced the full genome of the virus. So it seems like, at least in terms of openness, from what we know, they seem to be most on top of it. Now, again, we've heard cases like this. Romania said this early on. Russia also said this. Israel has said it. I think Germany was on something. Germany and France had a joint project early on. But granted, again, that doesn't take into account how the virus would evolve and change and adapt over time. Since those are stories from like January, February. And I, again, I'm not going to put too much stock into this. As I said, as I list off all the other ones that we just went over that turned out to be nothing. But I, maybe I'm just looking for some optimism in all of this chaos that I'm willing to believe it a bit more than I would under normal circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's understandable. When I see the possibility that there's something around the corner, or at least a treatment, something that might be overlooked, something that was quite simple and was always there but needed a tweak of some kind. Yeah, I mean, I'm hopeful about it. I'm not skeptical. I say try it. Um, and of course it's still early on, so we have to space ourselves, so to speak. um, but Trump has not handled this very well. In a way, he's had moments where he could have shone and he didn't. And we have the examples, of course, the mainstream media calling it the China virus first, Nancy Pelosi urging people in San Francisco to go to Chinatown to prove you're not a xenophobe. Um, we and the of course the mainstream media is never going to cover that, and we know why. We know how blue power, red power works in the U.S. But this is something to expect. Um, so he's had opportunities where he would have been able to come out on top, and they'll shift gears. They'll make the same mistakes. They won't pay for it, but Trump by now has to understand that is the way it is, and nothing is going to change that. That's the way, to use an Alex Jones term, that's the way the programming works. So, yeah, I mean, even silly things like getting that Delco plant to make the respirators, when a company like Philips that makes respirators, makes imaging products, makes safety masks. What does Philips not do? Clocks. I mean, they've been doing this for decades. This is a highly respected, competent, smart company that's been around for ages, and they make respirators.
Yeah, and
So, I mean, so why did he choose GM? I mean, he chose GM, and it's literally the only plant that could be retooled to do something like this. Everybody would have to be retrained. He did it for optics. He did it for political optics when he should never have done that.
yeah,
You know,
and
especially, I mean, the boomers will love it, right? Because it'll remind them of the '80s. When with Reagan and his battle with the Japanese auto manufacturers, and I mean that's what this reminds me of. But the truth is, he's never going to get those respirators in time. He went for a political move, and he did actually hurt his country by doing this. He should have gone to Philips. He should have ordered this many done and stopped any other bidder. This was going to be the price. We're not going to be hit with a loss, and they would have been the amount of respirators needed would have probably not been met, but it probably would have been better than what GM has suggested, that maybe they could do 10,000 by the end of April. And of course, he said that they would have 40, which is ridiculous.
yeah, and look, Trump fell into the trap that he always falls into, where he's trying to please the people who hate his guts, whether that be the media, whether that be the political establishment, any of these various groups, trying to win favor with them and kowtowing to what they want. And what he does is never good enough, rather than actually taking his own initiative and doing what
Yeah.
he wants. And again, we've seen this since he came into office, and you point out with GM, like in terms of making the respirators, in terms of making the ventilators. Yeah, the entire factories have to be retooled, the workers have to be retrained, as opposed to, like you said, Philips, more fitting companies that can do this. Now, Trump definitely has, look, his response has gone back and forth. Sometimes it looks really good, sometimes he can really get together, other times he completely drops the ball like he did now. But this is a systemic problem, as you were getting to. We've had a shortage of ventilators since, I believe, the 2000s. We've outsourced these things. This is more a story out of Australia, but I mean, it applies all across the Western world where foreign investors would buy up all these medical supplies. And again, this was like in the early 2010s, like 2012. Some Chinese or Taiwanese, can't remember, somewhere from East Asia in Australia bought a a lion's share of medical supplies and controls the Chinese market, and he's sending them back to his home country now that Australia needs them, of course, because look, we know where the loyalties of these people really lie. And again,
Mm-hmm.
also Israel buying up these things, and on top of China buying up these things to the point where letting your prostituting out your nation. I know no better way of saying this. Like the entire Western world has done, especially the Anglosphere, has resulted in this. Again, we've had these problems since the 2000s, where the worst thing we had in that time period, which I definitely do not mean to downplay any of this because it was pretty impactful to say the least, was the 2008 financial crisis. But again, that wasn't topped with a what is nothing nothing less than a medical emergency. And we thought times would stay good forever. We thought the Spanish flu was the last time that'll ever happen. These various viruses, we've defeated them before. We've advanced beyond that. Again, sort of that end of history mindset to the point where, oh,
Mm-hmm.
Japanese, Chinese, Taiwanese investors want to buy this. Israeli investors want to buy up this medical equipment. Why not? It's good for the economy. It's good for the GDP. It's good for quote unquote American jobs that we're going to ship overseas. And then all of a sudden, when the time of crisis breaks out like this, we find ourselves completely caught off guard. And again, there aren't many people you can blame for this. First and foremost, the globalist elite, and of course their cohorts. I mean, again, globalist kind of implies, worldwide. But again, you can point just as much a finger as Israel as you can, China as you can, Japan, pretty much. But again, I think when that many countries are taking advantage of you, where the blame really lies is the people who have allowed that. Look, if it's one or two, you can blame those countries. But when and you can arguably blame those countries. But when it gets to the level
Mm-hmm.
where dozens of nations are taking advantage of you, within the same way, even up to this day, the blame lies in Washington D.C. I don't know how else to say it.
Right. So they have. You're right. They have been aware of this for a while. Alarm bells have been sounded off. There have been. I mean, various epidemics that have occurred since then. Nothing on this scale, understandably. But those were bullets that were dodged, and let's say that America doesn't even reach 10,000 dead or 5,000 dead, God forbid. But let's say that happens. If anything, this virus has pointed out, we said it last week, all the major cracks, all the flaws that exist in the West right now. Whether it's the so-called, the European Union, which doesn't really look like a union, doesn't really look like an organization that really can help each other in very stressful times. Uh, Whether it's the way we offshore our industries, whether it's the way we communicate with people who are economically adversarial to us, whether it's the way we will sell off literally a future for 2-3 generations in order to make massive amount of profits that literally did not trickle down. They didn't. I mean, they didn't trickle down. And this whole offshoring, this whole moving all the, and there's still people like I mean, I had a friend that like texted me about I want the 20 the 20 largest cities in China nuked. Is that bad? Like, come on, man. Like, no, China didn't force you at gunpoint to move all your factories there. Greed did. My capitalism, my free market, and all that. And it was the hubris of just. I mean, the hubris was already there over a decade before even the Soviet Union fell. But I mean, after it fell, the kind of optimism that has pervaded in the West, and the kind of tragic and foreseeable mistakes that were made is really. I mean, if anything proves the cyclical nature of history, it's this.
Oh, absolutely. And uh, like you said, we sold off our future, and frankly, we're paying the price for this right now. And again, I've hammered on this for the past couple episodes. As much justifiable blame you can put on China, again, we've been over this. At the end of the day, it lies where, well, who let it happen, and why did they let it happen? And the point where pointing the finger at China and their stranglehold over the World Health Organization, which, again, whatever little credibility they had before has completely dissipated. But you can do that all day long. But at the end of the day, let's say this does bring down China. Let's say this does completely collapse it and creates a new rift between China and the West. Well, I can tell you what I think would happen, at least, or something guaranteed. We're going to move all our industry. We're going to manufacture all our drugs in India or Indonesia or Vietnam,
Yeah.
and the exact same thing is going to happen in 30 years.
Right. You don't get the sense there's just no talk about changing this pattern. They're just going to choose another country instead of China. I mean, is it really so awful to give the opportunity for Americans, in other words, yeah, is it so awful that we could bring back some of these factories and give people within the West, in America and Europe, the ability to have good paying jobs for these absolutely essential industries? I mean, the fact that America doesn't even have one of these factories now is absolutely mind-boggling. Um, you can presume through soft power that you really are, the king of the world, but it takes one crisis to point out that that's not possible. That hard power, like factories, means something. Production means something. Labor counts.
Yeah, and
These have value, and of course, China is not going to give you those things if they're afraid that because H1N1 they had over 1 million dead. I mean, they're not interested in that repeating all over again. So of course they're going to hoard it or use it themselves first. I cannot imagine if an outbreak like that happened in America with, let's say, a similar example with a far greater death toll just 10 years prior. Like, America isn't going to say, you know what, we're going to need a lot of these, but we owe the world these. It's not going to happen. I mean, America sent bedding to Italy for goodness sake. Like, so yes, it's left us unprepared and really not looking like a serious country or a serious civilization. I'm hoping that there will be some countries who will lead the way. You know, it doesn't have to be America. It could be several other countries, and it could be someone completely unexpected. You just need a few news stories about how they're going to make sure that they have, let's say, at least two pharmaceutical factories working all the time. That every country should have at least one respirator factory working all the time, minimum one, preferably three or four. All you need to do is see a little bit of something like this develop in order to get the ball rolling.
yeah, and
In order for a country to provide something more than just service industry jobs.
I think the last couple points I'll make here is one of the big reasons I think Trump, or more appropriately, the people controlling Trump, don't want to do this because the minute they revive domestic industry is game over for their globalist plan. They're gonna ask the questions: why is this
Yeah.
all made abroad? Why aren't Americans taking these jobs? So they're gonna kick this can down the road. I think eventually they're going to do it like with the emergency payments, and uh, so they're just putting that off as long as possible and waiting, hoping it won't catch on. But they know the minute they do that, the idea of the global economy as we know it is dead. And the biggest frustration I have in all this is the British Empire would say their downfall was their overreliance on the colonies, especially in both world wars, whether that be in raw resources or manpower. And you're seeing a similar problem in the United States, but the big difference is the United States is one of the few countries, not only today, but in the history of the world, with the amount of land it controls, with the population size it has, with the resources it has, that could fulfill the dream of every state, and I mean every state, to be an autarkic system, completely self-sufficient. Now we wouldn't be nearly as prosperous. We wouldn't have the latest gizmos and gadgets and all these worthless consumer goods. I imagine we'd have some of it, but again, it wouldn't be to. Life would be a lot less "quote unquote" luxurious if that were the case. But the United States is one of the few countries in the history of the world that has the ability to be, if not entirely, almost entirely self-sufficient. So I find it, especially as an American, especially frustrating when we farm out all our manufacturing, especially a vital industry, to the rest of the world. Because a lot of empires, they had no choice. Again, Rome, their breadbasket was in North Africa. The British, they relied on India for raw materials. France, they relied on their African colonies for raw materials and manpower when it came to wars. The United States does not need any of that. The amount of land we control on this continent could be considered an empire within itself. And the
Hmm.
fact that for short term profit, we completely have foregone the ability to be a self sufficient, thriving nation where, look, events of the world, they'll obviously impact us, but to the extent they impact us today, where a market downturn in China or a plague outbreak in China completely turns our country on its head, realistically, that should not be happening with the geographic and resource rich position this country's in. But that's my final rant for the show. If you have any other words, now's the time because I think I'm going to bring it to a close in a couple minutes here.
Yeah, no, I don't have anything. This is I have only one thing. It's kind of funny. It's an aside. I think we all remember when Macron said that NATO is brain dead. Well, NATO has been saved. A committee has been formed made up of 5 men and 5 women that are going to help reintegrate Europe and NATO along the lines of culture and politics and so on and so on. I bring that up because I think you know in a different way, basically saying the same thing that this moment it still will not stop them from letting go of the kind of trajectory that they're on, that they still have not learned their lesson. Now, I don't see any evidence of it right now.
Well, I think the important question is look, we have the general quality. How many minorities were on that panel?
Yeah, yeah, indeed.
Because I say if it's not at least 30%, then the West is doomed. But that was a hell of an episode. I think we did a good job not dedicating the entire thing to the elephant in the room. And when we did, I think we did a pretty good job keeping it diverse in terms of the topics about it. Let us know what you think in the live chat in the comments. Hopefully, this episode lives up to the rest. I think we covered all our bases here, and we will see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Take care.